The rain drummed against the courthouse windows with the persistence of doubt, each droplet a reminder of the storm brewing inside courtroom 4B. Sarah Chen sat rigid in the defendant's chair, her hands folded so tightly her knuckles had turned white. The fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows across her face, emphasizing the dark circles under her eyes, evidence of too many sleepless nights spent preparing for this moment. "Your Honor," her mother's voice cut through the sterile air like a blade, "I need you to understand something about my daughter." Margaret Chen rose from her seat in the gallery, her designer handbag clutched against her chest like armor. "She's brilliant, yes. Harvard Law Review, summa cum laude, all of that. But she's unemployable." The word hung in the air like smoke from a fire that refused to die. Sarah felt her chest tighten, the familiar ache of disappointment spreading through her ribs. 28 years old, and she was still that little girl, desperate for her mother's approval, still the teenager who'd brought home straight A's, only to be told they weren't from the right classes. Unemployable? Chief Justice Margaret Thompson leaned forward, her silver hair catching the light. Her voice carried the weight of 30 years on the bench, but also something else. Curiosity, perhaps even concern. "Mrs. Chen, that's quite a statement to make about someone with your daughter's credentials." Margaret Chen's laugh was bitter, practiced. "Credentials don't pay rent, Your Honor. My daughter has been fired from 3 prestigious law firms in 2 years. She can't hold a job, can't work with people, can't—" "That's enough." Sarah's voice surprised everyone, including herself. She stood slowly, her legs shaking but her voice steady. "Your Honor, if I may address the court." The Chief Justice nodded, gesturing for Margaret Chen to sit down. The older woman's face flushed red, but she complied, her lips pressed into a thin line of disapproval. Sarah took a breath, tasting the recycled courthouse air, feeling the weight of everyone's expectations pressing down on her shoulders. This wasn't how she'd imagined her career would go. Fresh out of Harvard 5 years ago, she'd been the golden child, the one who was going to change everything. Now she stood before the highest court in the state, not as a celebrated attorney, but as a defendant in a civil suit brought by her former employer. "Your Honor, I'm here because Blackstone and Associates claims I breached my employment contract by representing a client whose interests conflicted with theirs. They're seeking damages of $2 million. She paused, her voice catching slightly. "What they're not telling you is that I was representing a group of construction workers who were being poisoned by asbestos. Asbestos that Blackstone's biggest client knew about and chose to ignore." Chief Justice Thompson's eyebrows rose slightly. In the gallery, Margaret Chen shifted uncomfortably in her seat. "I see," the Chief Justice said slowly, "and your mother's assessment of your employability." Sarah glanced back at her mother, seeing the familiar mixture of disappointment and embarrassment in her eyes. "My mother believes that standing up for what's right makes me unemployable." She may be correct. The courtroom fell silent, except for the continued drumming of rain against the windows. Sarah could hear her own heartbeat, could feel the sweat beading on her forehead, despite the courthouse's aggressive air conditioning. Chief Justice Thompson studied her for a long moment, her fingers steepled in front of her face. Finally she spoke, her voice carrying clearly through the hushed room. "Ms. Chen, in my 30 years on this bench, I've seen thousands of attorneys. I've watched them lie, cheat, manipulate, and compromise their values for money, prestige, or power. Your mother says you're unemployable." She paused, leaning forward slightly. "I look at you, and I see something different. You're not unemployable, Ms. Chen. You're overqualified." The words hit Sarah like a physical force. Overqualified, not unemployable, not a failure, not a disappointment. Overqualified. "This case is dismissed," Chief Justice Thompson continued, her gavel echoing through the silent courtroom. "Blackstone and Associates' claim lacks merit. Ms. Chen was following her ethical obligations as an attorney. If that makes her unemployable in some circles, then perhaps those circles need to examine their own values." As the courtroom erupted in whispered conversations and the shuffle of papers, Sarah remained standing, frozen in place. Behind her, she heard her mother gathering her things with sharp, angry movements, but she couldn't turn around. She couldn't face the inevitable lecture, the disappointed sighs, the questions about what she was going to do now. Instead, she watched Chief Justice Thompson, who was looking directly at her with something that might have been approval or perhaps recognition. one professional to another. "Ms. Chen," the Chief Justice said quietly, just loud enough for Sarah to hear over the courtroom noise, "I'd like to speak with you in my chambers when you have a moment." And for the first time in months, Sarah felt something she'd almost forgotten existed: hope. The Chief Justice's chambers felt like stepping into a different world, one where mahogany bookshelves lined the walls from floor to ceiling, where leather-bound volumes of case law stood like sentinels guarding decades of judicial wisdom. Sarah sat across from Margaret Thompson's massive oak desk, her hands wrapped around a cup of coffee that had long since grown cold. "Your mother's still waiting outside," Chief Justice Thompson observed, settling into her chair with the practiced ease of someone who'd spent years mediating conflicts. "She doesn't look particularly pleased." Sarah managed a weak smile. "She rarely is, at least not with me. Tell me about the asbestos case." The Chief Justice's voice was gentle but probing, the tone of someone accustomed to getting to the heart of matters. "The real story, not the legal briefs." Sarah set down her coffee cup, the ceramic making a soft clink against the saucer. Outside the chamber's windows, the rain had softened to a gentle patter, and afternoon sunlight was beginning to break through the clouds, casting long shadows across the Persian rug. "It started with a phone call," she began, her voice gaining strength as she spoke. "A man named Roberto Martinez. His English wasn't perfect, but his desperation was universal. He'd worked construction for Pemberton Industries for 15 years, started having trouble breathing, went to the doctor." She paused, remembering Roberto's weathered face, the way his hands had shaken as he told his story. "Mesothelioma. Terminal." Chief Justice Thompson nodded grimly. She'd seen enough cases to know where this was heading. Roberto wasn't alone. 12 other workers, all showing signs of asbestos exposure. Their families were terrified, angry, broke. The medical bills were crushing them, and Pemberton was claiming they had no knowledge of any asbestos risks. Sarah's voice hardened, but I dug deeper. Found internal memos dating back 8 years, documents showing Pemberton knew about the asbestos in their older buildings and chose to keep it quiet rather than pay for proper removal. And Blackstone represented Pemberton, has for 20 years. They're their biggest client, probably 40% of the firm's revenue. Sarah leaned forward, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "When I brought the case to my supervising partner, James Blackstone himself, he told me to drop it, said it was a conflict of interest, that I was putting the firm at risk. But you didn't drop it." "How could I?" The question came out more forcefully than Sarah had intended. "I met Roberto's wife, Maria. She was working 3 jobs to pay for his treatments. I met his daughter, Isabella. She's 8 years old, and she knows her daddy is dying because of something that could have been prevented. How do you look at a family like that and walk away because it's not financially convenient?" Chief Justice Thompson was quiet for a long moment, her fingers drumming softly against the desktop. "What did Blackstone do when you refused to drop the case?" "They fired me, claimed I was insubordinate, that I'd violated my employment agreement by taking on a case that conflicted with firm interests." Sarah's laugh was bitter. "Then they filed suit against me for breach of contract, claiming my actions had damaged their relationship with Pemberton and cost them millions in future billings." "And your mother supported this decision?" The question hung in the air like incense, heavy and suffocating. Sarah stared at her hands, remembering the conversation she'd had with her mother the night she'd been fired. "My mother has always believed that success means keeping your head down, following the rules, not making waves. She immigrated from Taiwan with nothing but a suitcase and a dream, worked 16-hour days in a factory to put herself through night school, became an accountant, married my father, bought a house in the suburbs." Sarah's voice grew soft, almost wistful. "She sacrificed everything for stability, for security. In her mind, what I did, risking my career for strangers, was throwing away everything she'd worked for." "And what do you think?" It was such a simple question, but it cut straight to the heart of everything Sarah had been struggling with for the past 6 months. What did she think? Not what her mother thought, not what Blackstone thought, not what society expected. What did Sarah Chen think? "I think," she said slowly, "that there are things more important than job security. I think that if we don't stand up for people like Roberto Martinez, then what's the point of all our education, all our privilege, all our opportunities?" days. Chief Justice Thompson smiled, the first genuine smile Sarah had seen from her. That's exactly what I hoped you'd say. Sarah looked up, confused. Your Honor, Miss Chen, how familiar are you with the State Attorney General's office? The question caught Sarah off guard. Somewhat familiar. They handle major litigation for the state, civil rights cases, consumer protection. They also handle cases involving corporate malfeasance, environmental crimes, and workplace safety violations. Chief Justice Thompson leaned back in her chair. It so happens that I have lunch with Attorney General Patricia Williams every month. We were in law school together, back when there were only 3 women in our class. Sarah's pulse quickened. I'm not sure I follow. The AG's office has been building a case against Pemberton Industries for the past year. They've been looking for someone with specific expertise in construction law and corporate liability, someone who understands the industry but isn't compromised by existing relationships. Thompson's eyes glinted with something that might have been mischief, someone who's proven they're willing to put justice ahead of profit. You're offering me a job? Sarah's voice came out as barely more than a whisper. I'm offering you a chance to do what you clearly were meant to do. Fight for people who can't fight for themselves. The pay isn't what you'd make at a big firm, but it's honest work. Important work. Sarah felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes. For months, she'd been applying to firms, temp agencies, even considering leaving law altogether. The constant rejection, combined with her mother's disappointment and her own mounting debt, had worn her down to almost nothing. Why? She managed to ask. Why would you help me? Chief Justice Thompson stood up, walking to the window that overlooked the city square. In the distance, construction cranes dotted the skyline, and Sarah couldn't help but think of Roberto Martinez and the countless other workers whose safety depended on people like her being willing to fight. Because 30 years ago, I was you, Thompson said quietly, fresh out of law school, idealistic, ready to change the world, and I was told more than once that I was unemployable, too aggressive, too principled, too unwilling to compromise. She turned back to Sarah. Sometimes being unemployable in the wrong places is exactly what qualifies you for the right ones. 3 weeks later, Sarah sat in her new office on the 15th floor of the State Attorney General's building, staring out at a view she never could have afforded as a private attorney. The space was modest, a metal desk, 2 chairs, and a bookshelf that had seen better decades, but it was hers. More importantly, it came without the suffocating weight of billable hour requirements and partnership politics. The Roberto Martinez case files were spread across her desk like pieces of a complex puzzle she was finally beginning to solve. Medical records, employment histories, internal company documents that Pemberton's lawyers had fought tooth and nail to keep sealed. Each page told a story of corporate negligence and human suffering that made her stomach turn and her resolve strengthen in equal measure. A soft knock on her door interrupted her concentration. Come in. Attorney General Patricia Williams stepped into the office, carrying 2 cups of coffee and wearing the kind of smile that had probably intimidated opposing counsel for the past 2 decades. Patricia was everything Sarah hoped to become: sharp, confident, uncompromising in her pursuit of justice, but still somehow warm and approachable. How are you settling in? Patricia asked, handing Sarah one of the coffee cups and settling into the chair across from her desk. It's different, Sarah admitted, gesturing at the files surrounding them. Good different. At Blackstone, I felt like I was drowning in corporate politics. Here, I feel like I'm actually practicing law. Patricia nodded knowingly. Margaret Thompson told me you might say something like that. She has excellent instincts about people. She paused, studying Sarah's face. Have you spoken with your mother since you started? The question hit like a punch to the solar plexus. Sarah had been dreading this conversation, but she supposed it was inevitable. Her relationship with her mother had been strained for years, but the past month had pushed it to a breaking point. She's not speaking to me, Sarah said quietly. She thinks I'm throwing my life away for strangers who won't appreciate the sacrifice. She made air quotes around her mother's exact words, which had been burned into her memory during their last explosive phone call. That must be incredibly difficult. Sarah set down her coffee and leaned back in her chair, suddenly feeling exhausted. The hardest part is that I understand where she's coming from. My mother came to this country with nothing. She worked herself to the bone to give me opportunities she never had. In her mind, taking a government job instead of pursuing partnership at a major firm is spitting in the face of her sacrifices. And what do you think? It was the same question Chief Justice Thompson had asked, but coming from Patricia, it felt different, less like a test and more like an invitation to explore her own feelings. I think, Sarah said slowly, that she sacrificed so I could have choices. And I'm choosing to use my privileges and opportunities to help people who don't have them. She paused, looking out the window at the bustling city below. I just wish she could see it that way. Patricia was quiet for a moment, sipping her coffee thoughtfully. You know, my mother had similar concerns when I left private practice to become a prosecutor. She couldn't understand why I'd give up a lucrative career to work for the government. What changed her mind? Time and results, Patricia smiled. When she saw the cases I was winning, the people I was helping, the difference I was making, she started to understand. Your mother will too, Sarah. Give her time to see who you're becoming instead of mourning who she thought you should be. Sarah nodded, though she wasn't entirely convinced. Margaret Chen was nothing if not stubborn, and she had very fixed ideas about success and security. Speaking of results, Patricia continued, shifting into business mode. How's the Pemberton case coming along? Sarah's expression brightened immediately. This was where she felt most confident, most in her element. We've got them dead to rights. The internal memos are devastating. They clearly knew about the asbestos exposure and made a calculated decision to cover it up rather than address it. I've identified 43 workers who were exposed over a span of 8 years. 43? Patricia's eyebrows rose. I thought we were looking at 12 cases. That was just the beginning. Once word got out that someone was finally taking their claims seriously, more workers came forward. Some are already showing symptoms, others are terrified about what might develop. Sarah pulled out a thick folder. I've been working with Dr. Elena Rodriguez at St. Mary's Hospital. She's an expert in occupational lung diseases. She's agreed to testify about the long-term health impacts of the exposure. Patricia leaned forward, her interest clearly piqued. What kind of settlement are we looking at? I'm not interested in a settlement. The words came out more forcefully than Sarah had intended, and Patricia's coffee cup paused halfway to her lips. Excuse me? Sarah felt her cheeks flush, but she pressed on. I mean, obviously we'll consider any reasonable offer, but I don't think a settlement serves justice here. These workers need their medical expenses covered, yes, but more than that, we need to send a message that this kind of corporate negligence has consequences, real consequences. Patricia set down her coffee cup slowly, her expression unreadable. Sarah, you've been here 3 weeks. Pemberton Industries is a major employer in this state. They have connections, resources, political influence. They poisoned 43 people, Sarah interrupted, then immediately felt mortified for cutting off her boss. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to. Don't apologize. Patricia's voice was firm but not unkind. Never apologize for passion, but channel it strategically. What you're suggesting, taking Pemberton to trial instead of negotiating a settlement, that's a massive undertaking. We're talking about months of preparation, millions in litigation costs, and no guarantee of success. Sarah looked down at the files spread across her desk, seeing not legal documents, but faces. Roberto Martinez struggling to breathe, his daughter Isabella asking why Daddy was sick, Maria working 3 jobs to pay for treatments that might buy them a few more months together. I understand the risks, she said quietly, but these people trusted me to fight for them. Not to negotiate them the best deal possible, but to fight. If I settle this case for money and allow Pemberton to avoid admitting wrongdoing, what happens to the next group of workers? The next company that decides it's cheaper to pay settlements than fix safety problems? Patricia studied her for a long moment, and Sarah held her breath, wondering if she'd just talked herself out of the best job she'd ever had. Finally, Patricia smiled. Not the polite, professional smile she'd worn when she'd entered the office, but something genuine and fierce. You know what Margaret Thompson said about you when she recommended you for this position? Sarah shook her head. She said you were the most unemployable person she'd ever met, and that's exactly why we needed you. Patricia stood up, gathering her coffee cup. Prepare for trial, Sarah. Let's show Pemberton Industries what overqualified really means. 6 months later, the courtroom was packed to capacity. Sarah had never seen anything like it. Workers in hard hats and work boots sitting next to reporters with notebooks, family members clutching tissues, and corporate executives in $1,000 suits, trying to look confident while their world crumbled around them. The air was thick with tension and the weight of expectations. Roberto Martinez sat in the front row, his breathing labored, but his eyes bright with determination. The treatments had bought him time, but everyone knew it was borrowed time. His wife Maria held his hand tightly, and 8-year-old Isabella sat between them, coloring in a book, but occasionally looking up at Sarah with the kind of trust that made her heart ache. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," Sarah began, her voice carrying clearly through the hushed courtroom. "Over the next few days, you're going to hear a lot of complicated legal arguments, technical terminology, and corporate explanations. I want you to remember, through all of that complexity, that this case is really about something very simple: the difference between right and wrong." She walked slowly in front of the jury box, making eye contact with each of the 12 jurors, men and women from all walks of life, people who understood what it meant to work for a living, to worry about their families' safety, to trust their employers to protect them. 8 years ago, Pemberton Industries knew they had a problem. They knew that workers in Building C were being exposed to dangerous levels of asbestos. They knew that exposure could cause cancer, lung disease, and death. They had a choice: spend money to fix the problem or hope no one would notice. She paused, letting the silence stretch. They chose to hope. From the defense table, Pemberton's lead attorney, Jonathan Hayes, a man Sarah recognized from her Blackstone days, was taking notes furiously, no doubt preparing his objections. Hayes was everything Sarah had once thought she wanted to be: successful, respected, feared by opposing counsel. Now, looking at him, she felt nothing but pity. "Roberto Martinez trusted Pemberton Industries," she continued, her voice growing stronger. "He trusted them when they said the workplace was safe. He trusted them when they gave him safety equipment that they knew was inadequate. He trusted them with his life, and they betrayed that trust for profit." As she spoke, Sarah caught sight of a familiar figure in the back of the courtroom. Her mother, Margaret Chen, sat stiffly in the last row, her face an unreadable mask. They hadn't spoken since Sarah had taken the job with the AG's office, and seeing her now, Sarah felt a complex mix of emotions: hope, fear, longing, and determination. But she couldn't let herself be distracted. Not now, when everything mattered. The defense is going to tell you that this was an accident, that Pemberton couldn't have known how dangerous the exposure was. They're going to show you studies and expert witnesses and complicated charts. Sarah walked back to the plaintiff's table, where boxes of evidence sat stacked like a fortress of truth. "But we have something more powerful than their studies. We have their own words." She held up a document that had become the centerpiece of their case, an internal memo from Pemberton's safety director to the CEO, dated 7 years earlier, explicitly warning about asbestos exposure and recommending immediate remediation. The CEO's response, scrawled in red ink across the bottom, was damning. "Too expensive. Revisit next quarter." The next quarter had become the next year, which had become the next several years, until workers started getting sick and the truth could no longer be hidden. "Roberto Martinez didn't choose to be exposed to asbestos," Sarah said, her voice rising with passion. "But Pemberton Industries chose to expose him. They chose profit over people, convenience over conscience, and now Roberto is dying because of that choice." She turned to look at Roberto, who was watching her with tears in his eyes. In the months they'd worked together, he'd become more than a client. He'd become a friend, a symbol of everything she was fighting for. "This isn't just about Roberto or the other 42 workers we represent. This is about accountability. This is about sending a message that in America you cannot poison your workers and expect to walk away with a slap on the wrist. She faced the jury again, her voice steady and sure. These people trusted Pemberton Industries with their lives. Now, we're asking you to trust in justice. As she returned to her seat, Sarah felt the familiar rush of adrenaline that came with a strong opening argument, but also something else, a sense of rightness, of being exactly where she was supposed to be, doing exactly what she was meant to do. Jonathan Hayes rose for the defense, smooth and polished as always. Ladies and gentlemen, this is a tragedy. No one disputes that. Mr. Martinez and the other plaintiffs are suffering, and we have tremendous sympathy for their situation. Sarah had to resist the urge to roll her eyes. The "we feel bad, but it's not our fault" defense, a classic corporate strategy. But sympathy, Hayes continued, cannot be allowed to override facts. The fact is that Pemberton Industries followed all applicable safety regulations. The fact is that asbestos was a commonly used material in construction for decades, and its dangers were not fully understood by anyone in the industry. He was good, Sarah had to admit. Confident, persuasive, the kind of attorney juries trusted, but he was also defending the indefensible, and she could see from the jurors' faces that they weren't buying it. Over the next 3 days, Sarah methodically built her case. She called Dr. Elena Rodriguez, who explained in clear, devastating detail how asbestos exposure causes mesothelioma and why Pemberton's safety measures were woefully inadequate. She called former Pemberton employees who testified about the company's culture of cost-cutting and corner-cutting. Most powerfully, she called the workers themselves, men and women who had trusted their employer and were now paying the ultimate price. Roberto Martinez's testimony was the emotional climax of the trial. Despite his failing health, he insisted on taking the stand himself. "I worked for Pemberton for 15 years, he said, his voice raspy but determined. "I was proud of my work. I helped build schools, hospitals, homes where families would live and be happy. I never asked for much. Just honest work for honest pay, and the promise that my employer would keep me safe." He paused, struggling for breath. "They broke that promise. And now, my daughter has to watch her father die because someone decided that her father's life wasn't worth the cost of proper safety equipment." By the time Roberto stepped down from the witness stand, there wasn't a dry eye in the courtroom. Sarah glanced back and saw her mother dabbing at her eyes with a tissue, her composed mask finally cracking. The defense case was predictably technical, focused on regulatory compliance and industry standards, but Sarah could see the jury wasn't buying it. When Hayes put Pemberton's CEO on the stand, the man came across as cold and calculating, more concerned with protecting his company's stock price than acknowledging the human cost of their decisions. During closing arguments, Sarah stood before the jury one final time, feeling the weight of every hope and expectation in the room. Roberto Martinez isn't asking you to give him his life back. We all know that's impossible. What he's asking for is accountability. He's asking you to say that in America, corporate profits don't matter more than human lives. He's asking you to say that when a company chooses to prioritize money over safety, there are consequences. She looked around the courtroom, seeing Roberto and Maria, the other affected families, the reporters who would carry this story to the world, and finally her mother, who was watching her with something that might have been pride. "They called me unemployable for taking this case. They said I was throwing away my career for strangers who would never appreciate the sacrifice." Her voice grew stronger, more certain. "But these people aren't strangers. They're our neighbors, our community, our fellow Americans who deserve to be protected by the law. And if fighting for them makes me unemployable, then I'm proud to be unemployable." The jury deliberated for 6 hours. When they returned, the foreman stood with a piece of paper in his trembling hands. "We, the jury, find in favor of the plaintiffs and award damages in the amount of $47 million. The courtroom erupted. Roberto Martinez collapsed in tears, his wife and daughter embracing him tightly. Sarah felt her knees buckle with relief and exhaustion, but also with something deeper, a sense of validation, of purpose fulfilled. As the crowd began to disperse, Sarah felt a hand on her shoulder. She turned to find her mother standing behind her, tears streaming down her face. "I was wrong," Margaret Chen said quietly. "I was so terribly wrong about you." 1 year later, Sarah stood in the same courthouse where her journey had begun. But this time, the circumstances were entirely different. The conference room was filled with young law students from the local university, their faces bright with curiosity and ambition, notebooks poised to capture whatever wisdom she might offer. "The Chief Justice called you unemployable?" asked Jennifer, a second-year student with the kind of eager intensity Sarah recognized in herself at that age. Sarah smiled, remembering that day that seemed both a lifetime ago and like yesterday. "Actually, she called me overqualified. It was my mother who said I was unemployable." The students laughed, but Sarah could see the real question behind their polite smiles. "How do you know when it's worth risking everything for your principles?" "Let me tell you about Roberto Martinez," she began, and launched into the story that had changed her life. She told them about the phone call that had started it all, about the internal memos that had revealed Pemberton's knowledge and callousness, about the moment she'd decided to put her career on the line for people she'd never met. "What happened to him?" asked Marcus, a first-year student who had been scribbling notes frantically throughout her presentation. Sarah's expression grew soft. "Roberto passed away 6 months ago. The settlement money allowed him to get the best possible treatment, and he lived long enough to see his daughter start 4th grade and to know that his fight had prevented other families from going through what his did." She paused, feeling the familiar tightness in her chest that came whenever she thought about Roberto. "At his funeral, Isabella asked me to promise that I'd keep fighting for people like her daddy. That's a promise I intend to keep." Busy after the formal presentation ended, several students lingered to ask more detailed questions about the case, about working for the Attorney General's office, about the practical realities of public interest law. Sarah answered them all patiently, remembering her own uncertainty and idealism at their age. As the last student left, Sarah gathered her materials and prepared to head back to her office. She had 3 active cases now: another workplace safety matter, a consumer fraud investigation, and a civil rights lawsuit that was keeping her up at night with its complexity and importance. "Ms. Chen." Sarah turned to find Chief Justice Thompson standing in the doorway, wearing the same kind smile that had changed Sarah's life a year ago. "Chief Justice Thompson, I didn't realize you were here. I like to attend these student presentations when I can. It reminds me why we do this work." Thompson stepped into the room, closing the door behind her. "You've had quite a year." It was an understatement. In addition to the Pemberton victory, Sarah had won 2 other significant cases and had been profiled in the State Bar Journal as rising star in public interest law. The article had been framed and hung in her mother's office, a gesture that had meant more to Sarah than any professional accolade. "It's been the best year of my career," Sarah admitted. "Even with all the challenges, all the long hours, all the stress, I've never felt more fulfilled." "And your relationship with your mother?" Sarah smiled, thinking about the weekly dinners she and her mother had started sharing, the careful process of rebuilding trust and understanding. "We're getting there. She still thinks I'm crazy for giving up the big firm salary, but she's started to understand why I made that choice. What changed her mind? Seeing me happy, I think. For years, I was successful but miserable, making good money but coming home exhausted and empty every night. Now I make less money but I come home energized, excited about the work I'm doing." Sarah paused, organizing her thoughts. She realized that success isn't just about financial security. It's about finding work that matters, work that makes a difference. Chief Justice Thompson nodded approvingly. "Speaking of work that makes a difference, I have something I wanted to discuss with you." "Diki?" Sarah felt a flutter of curiosity mixed with nervousness. "Oh, I'm retiring next year. After 30 years on the bench, it's time for someone else to take the gavel." Thompson's eyes twinkled with something that might have been mischief. "The governor will be appointing my replacement, and I've been asked to submit recommendations." Sarah's pulse quickened. She had a feeling she knew where this conversation was heading, but it seemed too incredible to believe. "Patricia Williams speaks very highly of your work, and your track record this past year has been exceptional. More importantly, you've demonstrated the kind of judgment and integrity that we need on the bench." Thompson leaned forward slightly, How would you feel about being nominated for the state Supreme Court? The words hit Sarah like a thunderbolt. Supreme Court Justice. It was a position she'd never even dared to dream about, the kind of appointment that typically went to attorneys with decades more experience, prestigious backgrounds, political connections. I don't know what to say, she stammered. I'm honored that you'd even consider me, but surely there are more qualified candidates. More qualified? Thompson's laugh was warm and familiar. Sarah, a year ago I told you that you weren't unemployable. You were overqualified. Do you remember what that meant? Sarah nodded, though she wasn't entirely sure she did. It meant that you were too principled for some positions, too willing to put justice ahead of personal gain, too committed to doing what's right regardless of the consequences. Thompson stood up, walking to the window that overlooked the courthouse square. Those aren't flaws, Sarah. Those are exactly the qualities we need in a judge. Sarah felt tears pricking at the corners of her eyes. But I'm so young, and I've only been in public service for a year. And in that year, you've accomplished more meaningful work than many attorneys do in entire careers. You've shown that you're willing to fight for people who can't fight for themselves, that you won't be intimidated by powerful interests, that you understand what justice really means. Thompson turned back to her, her expression serious. The law isn't just about precedent and procedure, Sarah. It's about protecting the vulnerable, holding the powerful accountable, and ensuring that everyone, regardless of wealth or status, has access to justice. The weight of the offer was overwhelming. Supreme Court Justice at 29 years old, it would make her one of the youngest justices in the state's history. The responsibility was enormous, the scrutiny intense, the pressure unlike anything she'd ever experienced. But as she thought about it, Sarah realized she wasn't afraid. Intimidated, yes. Humbled by the magnitude of the opportunity, absolutely. But not afraid. What do I need to do? She asked quietly. Thompson smiled, the same smile that had launched Sarah's transformation from an unemployable idealist to an overqualified advocate for justice. Be yourself. Continue doing the work you've been doing. Let your record speak for itself. She paused. And prepare for the nomination hearing. It won't be easy. There will be questions about your experience, your qualifications, your commitment to judicial neutrality, despite your advocacy background. I understand, Sarah said, though she wondered if she truly did. The magnitude of the opportunity was still sinking in. There's one more thing, Thompson added, her voice taking on a more personal tone. Your mother will be proud, not just of the position, but of the woman you've become. Sometimes the greatest qualification for a job is being told you're not qualified for it by people who don't understand what the job really requires. 3 months later, Sarah sat in the same legislative chamber where she'd once felt like an outsider, watching politicians debate her future. The nomination hearing had been grueling. 3 days of intense questioning about her judicial philosophy, her limited experience, her rapid rise through the ranks of public service. Senator Patricia Hawkins, a conservative Republican who had made no secret of her opposition to Sarah's nomination, leaned forward with the predatory smile of someone about to deliver what she believed would be a fatal blow. Ms. Chen, you've been practicing law for barely 5 years, and most of that time has been spent as an advocate for liberal causes. How can the people of this state trust that you'll be impartial when you've built your entire career on activism? Sarah had been expecting this question for weeks. She took a breath, centering herself, thinking about Roberto Martinez and all the people whose lives had been changed by her willingness to fight for what was right. Senator Hawkins, with respect, I disagree with your characterization of my work as activism. What I've done is enforce the law. When Pemberton Industries knowingly exposed workers to asbestos, they broke the law. When corporations engage in fraud or discrimination, they break the law. My job has been to ensure that the law applies equally to everyone, not just those who can afford high-priced attorneys. But surely you can see how your background might create the appearance of bias. Senator, Sarah interrupted gently, let me ask you this. If a judge had spent their entire career defending corporations against workers' compensation claims, would you question their ability to be impartial in labor disputes? If a judge had built their reputation protecting wealthy tax evaders, would you worry about their bias in financial crimes cases? Hawkins shifted uncomfortably. That's different, is it? Because it seems to me that the only difference is which side of the power dynamic I've chosen to represent. And I would argue that a justice who has only ever seen the law from the perspective of the powerful might be more biased than one who has fought to ensure it protects everyone. The hearing room was silent for a moment. Sarah could see reporters scribbling frantically, could feel the weight of television cameras capturing every word. In the gallery, she spotted her mother, sitting straighter than Sarah had ever seen her, pride radiating from every line of her body. Senator James Morrison, the Democratic Committee chair, leaned forward. Ms. Chen, what do you say to critics who argue that your youth and limited experience make you unsuitable for the state's highest court? This question was easier, more familiar territory. Senator Morrison, I would say that experience isn't just about years of practice. It's about depth of understanding, commitment to justice, and willingness to make difficult decisions based on principle rather than convenience. She paused, thinking about the journey that had brought her to this moment. A year and a half ago, I was told I was unemployable because I wouldn't compromise my values for financial gain. Chief Justice Thompson looked at the same facts and concluded I was overqualified. The difference wasn't in my credentials, it was in what they valued most. And what do you value most? Morrison asked. Justice, real justice, not just for those who can afford it, but for everyone. The law is only as strong as our commitment to applying it fairly, regardless of wealth, power, or political influence. She looked around the chamber, making eye contact with each senator in turn. If confirmed, I won't bring a liberal agenda or a conservative agenda to the bench. I'll bring a commitment to the Constitution, to the rule of law, and to the principle that in America, justice should be blind to everything except the truth. The vote was closer than her supporters had hoped, 7-5 along mostly party lines, with 2 Republicans joining the Democratic majority. But it was enough. 6 months later, on a crisp October morning, Sarah stood in the same courthouse where her transformation had begun, wearing the black robes of a Supreme Court justice. Her mother sat in the front row, dabbing at her eyes with the same handkerchief she'd used during the Pemberton trial. Next to her sat Maria Martinez, who had become like a second mother to Sarah, and Isabella, now 10 years old and dreaming of becoming a lawyer herself. Chief Justice Thompson, in her final act before retirement, administered the oath of office, as Sarah repeated the ancient words, promising to support and defend the Constitution, to administer justice fairly and impartially, to faithfully discharge the duties of her office. She thought about the unlikely path that had led her here, from unemployable to overqualified to Supreme Court justice in less than 2 years. It seemed impossible, like something that happened to other people in movies or inspirational stories. But it had happened, and it had happened because she'd been willing to risk everything for her principles. After the ceremony, as friends and colleagues mingled in the courthouse rotunda, Sarah found herself standing with her mother in a quiet corner, both of them still processing the magnitude of the moment. I owe you an apology, Margaret Chen said quietly, her voice thick with emotion. I was so afraid of losing everything we'd worked for that I couldn't see what we might gain by standing up for what's right. Sarah took her mother's hand, feeling the calluses that remained from all those years of factory work, all those sacrifices that had made this moment possible. You don't owe me an apology, Mom. You gave me everything I needed to get here, education, opportunity, and most importantly, the strength to fight for what I believe in. Even when you didn't understand my choices, you gave me the foundation to make them. Margaret smiled through her tears. Roberto would have been so proud. He is proud, Sarah corrected gently, and his fight continues. Every case I hear, every decision I make, I'll remember what he taught me, that justice isn't about legal theories or precedents. It's about real people facing real problems, trusting that the system will protect them. As they spoke, a young woman approached them hesitantly. Sarah recognized her immediately. Jennifer, the law student from her presentation at the university. Justice Chen, the young woman said nervously, I'm sorry to interrupt, but I wanted to thank you. Your story inspired me to apply for a summer internship with the Public Defender's Office, instead of pursuing corporate law. Sarah smiled, remembering her own journey from corporate ambition to public service. What changed your mind? You said something in your presentation about Roberto Martinez, asking you to promise to keep fighting for people like him. I realize that's what I want to do with my law degree. Fight for people who need someone in their corner. Jennifer paused, her cheeks reddening slightly. I know it sounds naive. It doesn't sound naive at all, Sarah assured her. It sounds like exactly the kind of thinking we need more of in the legal profession. Don't let anyone tell you that caring about justice makes you unemployable. Sometimes that's exactly what makes you overqualified for the work that really matters. As Jennifer walked away, beaming with renewed purpose, Sarah felt the familiar sense of rightness that had guided her through every major decision of the past 2 years. This was what she was meant to do, not just decide cases, but inspire the next generation of lawyers to see the law as a tool for justice rather than just personal advancement. The reception was winding down, and Sarah found herself alone for a moment in Chief Justice Thompson's former chambers, now her chambers. The mahogany bookshelves were the same, the Persian rug unchanged, but the desk had been cleared of Thompson's personal items and was waiting for Sarah to make it her own. On the desk sat a single file, her first case as a Supreme Court justice, a civil rights lawsuit challenging discriminatory housing practices brought by a group of families who had been systematically denied rental opportunities because of their race. The kind of case that would have been considered hopeless a generation ago, the kind of fight that required someone willing to put principle ahead of popularity. Sarah opened the file and began to read, feeling the familiar surge of purpose that came with important work. Outside her window, the sun was setting over the city, casting long shadows across the courthouse square, where she had first learned the difference between being unemployable and being overqualified. Her mother had called her unemployable because she couldn't see past the immediate costs of standing up for principle. Chief Justice Thompson had called her overqualified because she recognized that the most important qualifications for serving justice weren't found on a resume. They were found in the willingness to fight for what's right, regardless of the personal cost. Now, as the youngest Supreme Court justice in the state's history, Sarah understood that both assessments had been correct in their own way. She was unemployable by organizations that valued profit over principle, comfort over conscience, expediency over ethics, and she was overqualified for positions that didn't require moral courage, intellectual honesty, or a commitment to justice. But she was perfectly qualified for this job, the job of ensuring that the law served everyone, not just the powerful, the job of protecting those who couldn't protect themselves, the job of proving, one decision at a time, that in America, justice was not for sale. As she settled in to read the case file, Sarah smiled, thinking about Roberto Martinez and the promise she'd made to his daughter. The fight continued, but now she had the power to ensure that families like his would never again be abandoned by a system that was supposed to protect them. She was no longer the unemployable idealist who had stood in this courthouse 2 years ago, desperate for validation and terrified of her mother's disappointment. She was Justice Sarah Chen, overqualified for compromise, perfectly qualified for justice, and ready to spend the rest of her career proving that sometimes the people who are told they don't belong in the system are exactly the ones the system needs most. The file in front of her was thick with documentation, witness statements, and legal briefs. But Sarah knew that, at its heart, it was simple, just like the Roberto Martinez case, just like every case that really mattered. It was about right and wrong, about using the law to protect people who needed protection, about ensuring that the promise of equal justice under law wasn't just words carved in stone, but a living reality for everyone. She picked up her pen and began to work, ready to write the next chapter in her unlikely journey from unemployable to overqualified to exactly where she belonged.